At my grandson's birthday party, Jessica stood in front of all the relatives and announced that I was becoming a financial burden on the family. The room fell silent as she explained how my minimal contributions were holding back their children's future. Then her phone rang, and Margaret Chen from First National Bank asked to speak with her about my account. The color drained from Jessica's face as she listened to numbers that made her hands shake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The argument started over $27. $27 for Lucas's new soccer cleats that I'd offered to buy at the sporting goods store. Jessica's voice cut through the afternoon air in my small living room like a blade through paper. Harry, we've talked about this before. We don't need your charity. I sat in my worn recliner, the same chair Dorothy and I had picked out 32 years ago from the furniture warehouse downtown. The fabric had faded from deep blue to something closer to gray, and the armrests showed the wear patterns of decades of use. But it was comfortable, familiar, and right now it felt like the only solid thing in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath my feet. David stood by the window, his shoulders tense, avoiding eye contact with both his wife and me. My son had grown quieter over the past year, caught between his loyalty to me and his desire to keep peace in his marriage. At 45, he looked older than his years, stress lines creeping around his eyes, his hair thinning at the crown just like mine had at his age. "It's not charity," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's what grandfathers do. I want to help with the children." Jessica paced across my small living room, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum flooring that Dorothy and I had installed ourselves back in 1987. Everything about Jessica spoke of success and upward mobility, from her perfectly styled blonde hair to her expensive handbag that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in 2 months. "The children have everything they need," she continued, her tone growing sharper. "David has a good job. I have my position at Sterling Industries. We're not some charity case that needs handouts from someone living on Social Security." The words stung more than she probably intended, though something in her expression suggested they were meant to hurt. I pulled out my wallet, a simple brown leather billfold that had served me faithfully for over 2 decades, and counted out $30 in careful, deliberate movements. "For the cleats," I said, holding the bills toward David, "and maybe a few extra for lunch after practice." Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. $30, Harry? Do you know what David spends on Lucas's sports equipment in a month? What we invest in Emma's piano lessons, her art classes, their tutoring? Your $30 is a drop in an ocean we're already swimming in just fine." The silence that followed stretched between us like a canyon. David finally turned from the window, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Dad, she didn't mean it like that." But Jessica wasn't finished. "Actually, I did mean it exactly like that. Harry, I know this is difficult to hear, but we need to have an honest conversation about your situation. You're 75 years old, living in a house that's falling apart around you, stretching every dollar until it screams. Meanwhile, you're trying to contribute to expenses that are frankly beyond your means." She gestured around my modest living room, taking in the secondhand furniture, the faded family photographs on the mantel, the small television that still had knobs instead of a remote control. Her assessment was clinical, precise, and devastating. "The heating bill alone for our house costs more than your entire monthly income. Emma's private school tuition for 1 semester exceeds what you spend in a year."
I'm not saying this to be cruel, but you need to understand the reality of our different situations. I folded the $30 back into my wallet, my hand steady despite the tremor that had started in my chest. 30 years of marriage to Dorothy had taught me when to fight and when to listen, and right now I could hear something deeper in Jessica's voice than just frustration about money. "What is this really about?" I asked. Jessica stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare that reminded me uncomfortably of her father, Robert Sterling, the kind of man who measured everything in terms of profit margins and quarterly reports. "It's about Emma asking why Grandpa Harry lives in such a small house when Grandpa Robert has a swimming pool. It's about Lucas wondering why you can only afford to give him $5 for his birthday when his other grandfather writes checks with lots of zeros. It's about our children learning to expect less from life because they think modest means normal. David stepped forward, his voice tight with tension. Jessica, that's enough. No, David, it's not enough. Your father is a sweet man, and I know he loves the children, but his presence in their lives is teaching them to settle for mediocrity. When they see their grandfather counting out dollar bills while their friends' grandfathers are writing checks for college funds and family vacations, what message does that send? The room fell silent, except for the tick of the anniversary clock on my mantel, another relic from my marriage to Dorothy. I studied Jessica's face, seeing past the expensive makeup and professional styling to something raw and desperate underneath. "You're embarrassed by me," I said quietly. "I'm concerned about the example you're setting," she replied, but her cheeks colored slightly. "When we go to parent-teacher conferences and other families talk about their children's advantages, their opportunities, their grandfather's contributions to their trust funds, what are we supposed to say? That Harry brought soccer cleats?" The hurt in her voice surprised me. This wasn't just about money, I realized. This was about status, about belonging to a world where worth was measured in bank account balances and zip codes. "I love those children," I said. "I know you do." Jessica's voice softened slightly. "But love doesn't pay for college. Love doesn't provide the opportunities that will set them up for success. Love doesn't teach them to expect excellence from life." David moved to the couch, sitting heavily, his head in his hands. "This isn't how I wanted this conversation to go." "What conversation?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that this visit hadn't been spontaneous. Jessica sat down across from me, smoothing her skirt with nervous precision. "Harry, we think it might be time for you to consider some changes. This house is too big for one person, too expensive to maintain properly. There are some lovely senior communities in Millbrook, places where you could have companionship, activities, help when you need it." The words hit me like physical blows. They wanted me to sell Dorothy's house, to give up the garden she planted, the kitchen where we'd shared 47 years of morning coffee, bedroom where she died, holding my hand 3 years ago. "I'm not ready for that," I said. "None of us are ever ready," Jessica replied gently, and for a moment I glimpsed the woman David had fallen in love with underneath all the social climbing and financial anxiety. "But sometimes we have to make practical decisions instead of emotional ones." She pulled out a folder from her expensive handbag, the kind of preparation that told me this conversation had been planned for weeks. "We've researched some options. Pleasant Grove Manor has a wonderful reputation, and the monthly fees are actually less than what you're spending to maintain this house when you factor in utilities, repairs, property taxes." I didn't take the folder. Instead, I looked at my son, searching his face for some sign of the boy who used to help me in Dorothy's garden, who used to ask me to tell him stories about the old days when things were simpler. "David, is this what you want?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He raised his head, and I saw tears in his eyes. "Dad, I want what's best for everyone. For you, for the kids, for our family. This house is getting harder for you to manage, and we worry about you being alone here." "I'm managing fine." "Are you?" Jessica leaned forward, her voice gaining strength again. "Mrs. Patterson told David she saw you trying to fix the gutters yourself last month. You're 75 years old, climbing ladders, risking a fall that could put you in the hospital. What happens then? What happens when you can't take care of yourself anymore?" The questions hung in the air like smoke. I thought about Dorothy's final months, the slow decline, the medical bills that had eaten through our savings like acid through metal. The choices I'd made then, the sacrifices that had seemed so necessary, so obvious at the time. "I need some time to think about this," I said finally. Jessica nodded, standing up and smoothing her skirt again. Of course. But Harry, please understand that we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to plan for a future that works for everyone, especially the children. After they left, I sat in my quiet house listening to the sounds of evening settling around me. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the old furnace clicking on in the basement, the distant sound of children playing in the street outside. Normal sounds that had been the backdrop of my life for 3 decades. I walked to the mantel and picked up my favorite photograph of Dorothy, taken on our 25th anniversary at the lake cottage we used to rent every summer. She was laughing at something I'd said, her hair caught by the wind, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes from sharing a life with someone who truly knows you. "What would you do, Dot?" I whispered to the photograph. "How do we handle this one?" But Dorothy wasn't there to answer, and for the first time since her funeral, I felt completely and utterly alone. 3 days passed before David called. 3 long days of rattling around my empty house, replaying every word Jessica had spoken, every expression that had crossed my son's face during that painful conversation. The phone rang at 7 a.m., cutting through the quiet of my kitchen where I sat with my coffee and yesterday's newspaper. "Dad, can we meet somewhere? Just the 2 of us?" His voice carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept well. I agreed to meet him at Murphy's Corner Diner on Main Street, the same place where Dorothy and I used to go for breakfast every Sunday after church. The irony wasn't lost on me that some of my happiest memories were tied to a place where I now had to defend my right to remain in my own home. David was already waiting in a back booth when I arrived, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug like it was an anchor. He looked exhausted, older somehow than he had just 3 days earlier. The stress of being caught between his wife's ambitions and his father's dignity was taking its toll. "How are you holding up?" he asked as I slid into the opposite seat. "I've had better weeks," I admitted, signaling the waitress for coffee. "How are Emma and Lucas?" "They miss seeing you. Emma asked why you haven't been by to help her with her math homework." The simple statement hit harder than Jessica's calculated cruelty had. Those Thursday evening tutoring sessions with my granddaughter had become one of my greatest joys. Emma would spread her workbooks across my kitchen table while I made her hot chocolate, and we'd work through multiplication tables and word problems together. She was bright, curious, always asking questions that went beyond the assignment. "Jessica thinks it's better if we maintain some distance while we sort things out," David continued, reading my expression accurately. "Sort things out. Is that what we're calling it?" David's shoulders sagged. "Dad, I know how this looks. I know Jessica came across as harsh the other day, but she's not wrong about everything. This house is getting to be too much for you." I studied my son's face, searching for traces of the boy who used to help me repair the fence in our backyard, who would hand me tools and ask endless questions about how things worked. That curious child had grown into a man who seemed afraid to ask the hard questions, afraid to challenge his wife's certainties. "Tell me about the gutter incident," I said. David shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Patterson called Jessica at work. She was worried. Said she saw you up on a ladder trying to clear leaves. Dad, what if you'd fallen? What if no one had found you for hours? I've been cleaning those gutters for 30 years. You're not 30 years younger anymore." The waitress appeared with my coffee, offering a brief respite from the conversation. I stirred in cream and sugar, buying time to organize thoughts that felt scattered and defensive. "David, do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted to quit Little League because you struck out 3 times in one game?" His brow furrowed. "What does that have to do with anything? You came home crying, threw your glove in the closet, said you were done with baseball forever. Your mother and I sat you down at our kitchen table and we talked about the difference between giving up and making smart choices. I remember. What did we decide?" David's voice softened. "That quitting because something was hard wasn't the same as quitting because something wasn't right for me anymore. And you went back to the team and had my best season ever." I leaned forward, holding his gaze. "I'm not ready to quit, son.
I'm not ready to give up the life your mother and I built just because it's getting harder to maintain. But what happens when it becomes impossible to maintain? What happens when you can't manage anymore? The question hung between us like a sword. I thought about Dorothy's final year, how I had insisted on caring for her at home, despite the doctor's suggestions about hospice facilities, how I'd learned to give injections, manage medications, help her to the bathroom in the middle of the night when her strength failed. When that time comes, we'll face it together, as a family. But that time isn't now. David's phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen and his expression tightened. Jessica, she's wondering if we've reached any decisions. Have we? He silenced the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Dad, there's something else. Something Jessica didn't mention the other day because she thought it might be too much to discuss all at once. My stomach tightened. What? Money. The reality is, maintaining your independence is expensive. Property taxes, utilities, repairs, groceries, medical expenses. Your Social Security and pension cover the basics, but there's no buffer for emergencies. I thought about my checking account balance, carefully monitored, and stretched to cover each month's necessities. David was right. One major repair, one unexpected medical bill, and I'd be in serious trouble. We want to help. Jessica and I have talked about supplementing your income, helping with the bigger expenses, but she's concerned about setting a precedent, about creating a situation where you become financially dependent on us. I never asked to be anyone's financial burden. I know that. But the reality is, maintaining your current lifestyle is already straining your resources. What happens in 5 years? 10 years? At some point, the mathematics don't work anymore. The mathematics. Everything reduced to numbers on a balance sheet, to profit and loss calculations that couldn't account for the value of sleeping in the bed I'd shared with Dorothy, of tending the garden she'd planned, of remaining connected to the community where we'd built our lives. Has it occurred to you or Jessica that maybe I've managed my finances differently than you think? David's expression shifted slightly. What do you mean? I mean, maybe your assumptions about my financial situation aren't entirely accurate. Dad, I've helped you with your taxes for the past 5 years. I know what your income sources are. I nodded slowly. David did know about my visible income sources.
The Social Security payments, the modest pension from my years at Millbrook Manufacturing, the small interest from my savings account at First National Bank. What he didn't know was that those represented only a fraction of my actual financial picture. There are things you don't know, I said carefully. Like what? I hesitated, wondering how to explain 3 decades of careful financial planning that I'd kept private even from my own son. The patents I'd registered in the 1980s and 1990s, the licensing agreements that had generated steady royalties, the investment portfolio that Margaret Chen had helped me build over the years. Like the fact that I'm not as financially vulnerable as everyone assumes. David stared at me across the table, confusion clear on his face. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the possibility that Jessica's entire argument is based on incomplete information. Dad, I don't understand. If you have resources we don't know about, why are you living like you're struggling to make ends meet? The question struck at the heart of everything. Why had I continued to live modestly even as my investments grew? Why had I allowed my family to see me as financially inadequate when the truth was far more complicated? Because your mother and I learned the difference between having money and needing to show it off. Because we valued security over status symbols. Because we wanted to teach you that worth isn't measured by what you own. David's phone buzzed again. This time, he ignored it completely. Are you telling me you've been hiding money from us? I'm telling you that I've been careful with money in ways that might not be obvious to people who measure success by house size and car payments. The diner around us continued its morning rhythm. Coffee cups clinking, conversations flowing, the ordinary sounds of people starting their day without the weight of family conflicts pressing down on them. I envied their simplicity, their freedom from having to justify their choices to people who claim to love them. How much are we talking about? David asked quietly. Enough, I said. Enough to maintain my independence, enough to help with Emma and Lucas's education if needed, enough to ensure I never become the burden Jessica seems to think I already am. The color drained from David's face. Dad, are you serious? You've been letting Jessica lecture you about financial planning while sitting on some kind of nest egg? I've been letting Jessica reveal her true feelings about me without the complications of money clouding the issue. That's not fair, isn't it? Now I know exactly how she values me as a person, separate from any financial considerations. Now I know that my relationship with my grandchildren is seen as an embarrassment rather than a blessing. David buried his face in his hands. This is a mess. It's a clarification, I corrected. Jessica made it clear that my presence in your family's life is measured entirely by what I can provide financially. Well, now we know where everyone stands. She's gonna feel terrible when she finds out. Is she? Or is she going to be angry that I didn't reveal information she thought she was entitled to know? David's phone buzzed a third time. This time he answered it with visible reluctance. Jessica? No, we're still talking. No, nothing's been decided yet. Can I call you back? He hung up and looked at me with exhaustion written across every line of his face. She wants to know if you're getting reasonable about the senior living options. Tell her I'm being exactly as reasonable as she is. What does that mean? I finished my coffee and stood up, pulling a $20 bill from my wallet and placing it on the table. It means some conversations are long overdue, and some assumptions are about to be challenged in ways your wife isn't going to enjoy. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by Emma herself after school. She bounded up my front steps with the energy that only 8-year-olds possess, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her smile bright enough to chase away the October gloom that had settled over Millbrook like a heavy blanket.
Grandpa Harry? Mom said I could invite you personally. She thrust a hand-decorated envelope toward me, construction paper covered in glitter and crayons, my name spelled out in her careful second-grade handwriting. I opened the door wider, letting her into my front hallway where she immediately began examining the family photographs on the wall, the same ritual she'd performed during every visit for the past 3 years. What's the occasion, sweetheart? My birthday party. I'm turning 9 next Saturday, and Mom said we could have it at the community center with all my friends from school. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. There's going to be a bounce house and face painting and everything. I opened the invitation carefully, mindful of the glue and glitter that Emma had applied with generous 8-year-old enthusiasm. Inside, Jessica's neat handwriting provided the details. Riverside Community Center, Saturday afternoon, 2 to 5. At the bottom, a handwritten note that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Harry, Emma specifically requested that you be there. I hope you can make it. Jessica. The tone was different from our last conversation. Warmer, somehow, though I couldn't tell if it represented a genuine change of heart or simply Jessica's recognition that disappointing a child on her birthday would be poor form. Of course I'll be there, I told Emma, watching her face light up with pure joy. Wouldn't miss it for the world. She hugged my legs with the fierce affection that children reserve for people they trust completely, then stepped back to examine my living room with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection. Grandpa, how come your TV is so small? The question was innocent, the kind of observation children make without understanding the implications. But it reminded me uncomfortably of Jessica's assessment of my modest lifestyle, of the gaps between my grandchildren's expectations and my reality. It does everything I needed to do, I said simply. Lucas has a huge TV in his bedroom. It's bigger than your whole living room wall. I thought about Lucas's bedroom, which I'd seen during my last visit to David's house. The television was indeed massive, accompanied by gaming systems that cost more than I spent on utilities in 3 months. Emma's room was similarly equipped with electronics and toys that represented a level of casual wealth I'd never known as a child. Different families do things differently, I said, guiding her toward the kitchen where I kept a small stash of cookies specifically for grandchildren visits. Emma climbed onto one of my kitchen chairs, accepting the glass of milk and chocolate chip cookies I offered with the solemnity of someone participating in an important ritual. "Mom says you might move to a place with other grandpas and grandmas," she said between bites. The cookie turned to dust in my mouth. "Did she?" "She said it would be good for you to have friends your own age. But I told her you already have friends, like Mrs. Patterson next door and Mr. Murphy at the diner." Out of the mouths of babes, Emma had grasped something that Jessica seemed determined to ignore, that community wasn't something you could purchase or relocate to find. It was something you built over time, through shared experiences and mutual care. "What do you think about me maybe moving?" I asked, curious about her perspective. Emma's expression grew serious, the way children look when they're trying to solve problems that adults have made unnecessarily complicated. "I think it would be sad," she said finally. "Who would help me with math homework? Who would teach me about Mom's flowers in the garden? Who would tell me stories about when Daddy was little?" Each question hit like a small arrow to my heart. These were the intangible gifts I brought to my grandchildren's lives, the connections to family history and personal attention that couldn't be replaced by wealthy grandparents or expensive toys. "Besides," Emma continued, warming to her theme, "Mom said the place you might move to doesn't allow pets."
What would happen to Mr. Whiskers? Mr. Whiskers was the stray cat who'd adopted me 6 months after Dorothy's funeral. A scraggly orange tabby who showed up on my back porch one evening and simply decided to stay. I'd resisted at first, not wanting the responsibility or the emotional attachment, but gradually his presence had become a comfort, his purring companionship filling some of the silence that had consumed my house. I hadn't thought about Mr. Whiskers, I admitted. "See, you can't move. Mr. Whiskers needs you, and I need you, and Daddy needs you even if he doesn't say it very much anymore." The simplicity of her logic was both heartbreaking and empowering. Emma saw clearly what the adults in our family had obscured with financial concerns and social anxieties. She understood that relationships mattered more than living arrangements, that love couldn't be purchased or relocated. After Emma left, clutching a small wrapped gift I'd picked out weeks earlier, a jewelry box with a tiny ballerina that reminded me of her grace and energy, I found myself thinking about her birthday party with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The Riverside Community Center represented neutral territory, a public space where Jessica couldn't control every detail of the environment or guest list. But it also meant I'd be surrounded by other parents from Emma's private school, successful professionals who lived in the same social sphere as Jessica and David. I spent the rest of the week preparing for the party the way some people prepare for job interviews or court appearances. I selected my best casual outfit, khaki slacks and a button-down shirt that Dorothy had always said brought out my eyes. I purchased wrapping paper that looked appropriately festive without appearing either cheap or overly extravagant. I practiced small talk topics that might resonate with parents who measured success by different standards than I did. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather that matched my conflicted emotions about the day ahead. I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted to claim a strategic position where I could observe the social dynamics before being drawn into them. The party was already in full swing when I walked through the double doors. The main hall had been transformed into a child's paradise, with colorful streamers, balloon arrangements, and activity stations scattered throughout the space. The bounce house Emma had mentioned dominated one corner, filled with shrieking, laughing children who threw themselves into the inflatable structure with abandon. Jessica stood near the entrance, greeting arriving parents with the polished social skills that had served her well in her career. She wore a casually elegant outfit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, but she looked genuinely happy, her usual tension replaced by maternal pride. "Harry, thank you for coming," she said when she spotted me, her smile warmer than I'd expected. "Emma's been asking about you every 10 minutes. "Wouldn't have missed it," I replied, offering the gift bag. "Where should I put this?" She guided me to a table already overflowing with presents, wrapped packages and sophisticated papers with elaborate bows. My simple gift bag looked modest by comparison, but not embarrassingly so. "The other parents are over by the refreshment table," Jessica said, a subtle hint about where I should position myself socially.
I think you'll recognize some of them from school events. I did recognize several faces from Emma's school programs, though I'd never had extended conversations with any of them. They represented the professional class that dominated Millbrook's more affluent neighborhoods. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, people who drove the kind of cars I'd noticed in the community center parking lot. "Harry, good to see you!" Robert Sterling's voice boomed across the room as Jessica's father approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, his silver hair perfectly styled, his casual weekending clothes obviously expensive. "Hello, Robert," I replied, accepting his firm handshake while bracing myself for whatever conversational territory he might choose to explore. "Jessica tells me you're thinking about making some lifestyle changes," he said, his tone carrying the subtle implication that such changes were not only wise but overdue. "Smart thinking. Independence is important, but so is being realistic about what you can handle at our age." Our age. Robert was 3 years younger than me and lived in a lifestyle that included housekeepers, groundskeepers, and personal assistants who managed the details he preferred not to handle himself. His version of aging gracefully bore little resemblance to my daily reality. "I'm exploring my options," I said diplomatically. Good. Jessica showed me some of the facilities she's researched. Top-notch places, really. Much better than trying to maintain a whole house by yourself." Before I could respond, Emma appeared at my side, her face painted with elaborate butterfly wings that sparkled with glitter. "Grandpa Harry, come see the bounce house. I want to show you how high I can jump." She grabbed my hand with sticky fingers, pulling me toward the inflatable castle where a dozen children were engaged in various forms of aerial acrobatics. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I forgot about the social complexity surrounding me. "Watch this," Emma called out, launching herself into an impressive somersault that ended with her landing on her back, giggling with pure delight. I found myself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, caught up in the simple joy of watching my granddaughter celebrate another year of life. Around me, other parents were having similar moments, their professional concerns temporarily set aside in favor of their children's happiness. "She gets that fearlessness from David," Jessica said, appearing beside me as we watched Emma organize her friends into some kind of jumping competition. "He was always the one willing to try anything when we were dating." The comment surprised me with its warmth, its acknowledgement of family connections that transcended current tensions. For a moment, I glimpsed the woman David had fallen in love with, someone who appreciated qualities that couldn't be measured in financial terms. "David was always brave," I agreed. "Sometimes too brave. Dorothy used to say he'd try to climb mountains just to see what was on the other side. Emma's the same way. Last week she asked me why some kids have more stuff than others. Not jealous, just curious about how the world works." I watched my granddaughter help a smaller child navigate the bounce house entrance, her natural kindness on full display. "What did you tell her?" Jessica was quiet for a moment, watching her daughter with an expression that mixed pride and uncertainty. "I told her that different families have different circumstances, but that doesn't make any family better than another." The answer surprised me. It sounded like something Dorothy might have said, the kind of wisdom that valued character over circumstances. "That's a good answer," I said. Jessica turned to look at me directly, and I saw something vulnerable in her expression that I'd never noticed before. "Harry, I owe you an apology for some of the things I said last week. I was stressed about Emma's tuition increase, worried about college planning for both kids, and I took those concerns out on you in ways that were unfair." The admission caught me off guard. I'd been prepared for continued hostility or polite distance, not genuine remorse. "Family conversations can get heated," I said carefully.
They can, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. David helped me understand that my anxieties about providing for the children don't justify dismissing your role in their lives. Around us, the party continued its joyful chaos. Children ran between activity stations, parents chatted over coffee and cake. Emma held court near the present table with the imperial dignity of someone celebrating her special day.
I appreciate that, I said, though I wondered if this apparent change of heart would survive when financial pressures reasserted themselves. I hope you'll consider still being part of our family discussions about the future, even if we don't always agree on the best path forward. Before I could respond, the community center's main door opened and a woman in a business suit entered, scanning the room with the focused intensity of someone on a mission. Even from across the crowded hall, I recognized Margaret Chen from First National Bank, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the weekend setting. My stomach dropped as I realized she was walking directly toward our little group, her expression serious, her pace determined. After 30 years of managing my financial affairs with absolute discretion, Margaret Chen was about to shatter the carefully maintained illusion of my modest circumstances in the most public way possible. Margaret Chen moved through the crowded community center with the purposeful stride of someone who had driven across town on a Saturday afternoon for reasons that couldn't wait until Monday morning. Her black suit stood out sharply against the casual weekend attire of parents and children, marking her as someone conducting business in a place dedicated to celebration. I watched her approach with growing dread, my mind racing through possible explanations for her unexpected appearance. In 30 years of banking relationships, Margaret had never sought me out at a social gathering. Our interactions were confined to her office, conducted with professional discretion that protected both her client's privacy and her own reputation for handling sensitive financial matters. "Mr. Whitman," she said as she reached our small group, her voice carrying the formal tone she used for official business. "I apologize for interrupting your granddaughter's party, but we have an urgent matter that requires your immediate attention." Jessica's expression shifted from surprise to confusion as she looked between Margaret and me. The banker's presence clearly puzzled her. Why would someone from First National Bank need to speak to Harold Whitman about urgent financial matters when his accounts barely covered monthly expenses? "Perhaps we could discuss this on Monday," I suggested, hoping to deflect the conversation away from my family gathering. "I'm afraid this cannot wait until Monday," Margaret replied firmly. "There's been unusual activity on your accounts that requires verification, activity that suggests either fraud or a significant change in your financial circumstances that our security protocols flagged for immediate review." The color began draining from Jessica's face as she processed Margaret's words. Accounts, plural, security protocols. The language of substantial banking relationships that didn't align with her understanding of my financial situation. Robert Sterling stepped closer, his businessman's instincts activated by the mention of financial irregularities. "Is there some kind of problem? Identity theft, perhaps? Harry, you should be very careful about these situations at your age." Margaret's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was choosing her words with extreme care. "Mr. Whitman, without going into details that should remain confidential, I can tell you that the transfers you authorized yesterday have triggered our high-value transaction protocols. Given the amounts involved, we need to verify that these instructions came from you personally and that you understand the implications of moving this level of assets." High-value transaction protocols. The phrase hit Jessica like a physical blow. She stared at me with widening eyes, her mouth opening slightly as she tried to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about my financial circumstances. "What kind of amounts are we talking about?"
David's voice came from behind me. My son had approached during Margaret's explanation, drawn by the serious tone of adult conversation that had nothing to do with birthday party festivities. Margaret looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly seeking permission to discuss details that she would never reveal without client authorization. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire, filled with the weight of decisions that would reshape family relationships in ways that couldn't be undone. "It's fine, Margaret," I said quietly. "They're family. They should know." She nodded and pulled a folder from a briefcase, extracting documents that I recognized as account summaries and transaction records. Mr. Whitman instructed us yesterday to transfer $200,000 from his investment portfolio to establish education trust funds for his grandchildren. The transaction itself isn't problematic, but the amount triggered our verification protocols because it represents less than 8% of his total managed assets. The silence that followed was profound. Around us, children continued laughing and playing. Parents chatted over coffee. Emma organized her friends into elaborate games that filled the community center with joyful noise. But in our small circle, the revelation created a pocket of stunned quiet that seemed to insulate us from the celebration. Jessica's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, calculation, and finally something that looked like horror as she began to understand the implications of what Margaret had revealed. 8%, she repeated in a whisper. 8% of how much? Margaret consulted her documents with the precision of someone accustomed to delivering information that changed people's understanding of reality. Mr. Whitman's current portfolio balance, including stocks, bonds, certificates of deposit, and money market accounts, totals approximately $2.7 million. The education trusts he established yesterday will provide each grandchild with sufficient funds for undergraduate and graduate education at any institution they choose to attend. David sat down heavily in the nearest folding chair, his face pale with shock. Robert Sterling's expression had shifted from patronizing concern to something approaching awe. But it was Jessica's reaction that held my attention. She looked as if someone had struck her physically, her hand pressed against her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. 8.7 million? She said, her voice barely audible. Harold, you've been sitting on $2.7 million? I've been managing my finances responsibly, the way Dorothy and I always did. But why? The question exploded out of her with raw emotion. Why did you let me lecture you about money? Why did you let me suggest you couldn't afford to maintain your independence? Why did you sit there while I treated you like a financial burden? The anguish in her voice was genuine, but I sensed something else underneath it. Anger at being made to look foolish, frustration at having her assumptions challenged so dramatically. Because I wanted to know how my family truly valued me. I wanted to understand whether my presence in your lives was welcome for who I am or only for what I might provide. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. Mr. Whitman, if you're comfortable discussing this here, I should mention that yesterday's transfers are only the beginning of the estate planning changes you requested. The charitable foundations, the property investments, the additional family trusts. Implementing all of these changes will require several more meetings. Charitable foundations, property investments. Each phrase hit Jessica like another revelation. She looked around the community center as if seeing it for the first time, perhaps calculating how many similar facilities could be funded by the wealth she'd spent weeks dismissing as inadequate. Harry, Robert Sterling's voice carried a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Why the secrecy? Why live so modestly when you have this level of resources available?
I looked at Emma, who was showing her friends how to create elaborate balloon sculptures, completely absorbed in the simple joy of her 9th birthday celebration. She wore a paper crown that was slightly askew, her face paint was smeared from enthusiastic hugging, and her smile was radiant with the kind of happiness that money couldn't purchase. Because wealth should be a tool, not an identity, I said. Because I learned from watching families like yours that money can become a source of pressure and expectation that destroys the very relationships it's meant to protect. Jessica flinched at the reference to her family, but I continued. Because I wanted my grandchildren to love me for the time I spent with them, the stories I told them, the attention I gave their homework and their problems, not because they saw me as a source of financial opportunity. But the way I treated you, Jessica's voice cracked with emotion. The things I said about your house, your lifestyle, your ability to contribute to their future. Harold, I feel sick about this. Margaret gathered her documents efficiently, sensing that the family needed privacy to process revelations that would reshape their relationships. Mr. Whitman, I'll expect you in my office on Monday morning to complete the paperwork for the remaining transfers. And congratulations on your granddaughter's birthday, she added, glancing at Emma with a genuine smile before making her way back through the crowd toward the exit. David stood up slowly, his expression still stunned. Dad, I don't understand. Why did you let Jessica and me think you needed our help? Why did you let us worry about your financial security? Because your worry told me you cared about my well-being, I replied. But Jessica's reaction told me she was embarrassed by my circumstances rather than concerned about my welfare. The distinction hit its target. Jessica's face flushed with shame and recognition. She'd revealed herself completely during our previous conversations, showing that her concerns were about status and appearances rather than genuine care for my situation. I need some air, she said abruptly, walking quickly toward the community center's side exit. David looked between his departing wife and me with the expression of someone caught between competing loyalties. Go after her, I said. She's going to need time to process this. What about us? What about our conversation at the diner? All those concerns about your independence, your ability to manage, were you laughing at me the whole time? The hurt in his voice was real, and I felt the weight of my deception more heavily than I'd expected. I was never laughing, son. I was learning. Learning whether my family valued me as a person or saw me as a problem to be solved. And what did you learn? I watched Emma notice her mother's absence and look around the room with mild concern before being distracted by another friend arriving with a gift. I learned that some people love you for who you are, and others love you for what they think you should be. I learned that my granddaughter values my presence more than my presence. And I learned that financial security doesn't guarantee family security. David's phone buzzed with what was probably a text from Jessica, but he ignored it. Dad, this changes everything. The senior living discussions, the concerns about your independence, Jessica's suggestions about downsizing, none of that was necessary. Wasn't it? If I'd revealed my financial situation earlier, would we have had honest conversations about what my family actually wanted from me? Or would everyone have adjusted their behavior to accommodate my wealth rather than addressing their real feelings? Around us, the birthday party was reaching its crescendo. Emma was opening presents with the systematic enthusiasm of someone who had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. Her laughter rang out across the room as she discovered each new treasure, thanking each gift giver with genuine appreciation. She doesn't know, does she?
David asked, watching his daughter. About the education trusts, the financial security you've just provided for her future. No, and I'd like to keep it that way until she's old enough to understand that money is a responsibility, not just an opportunity. David nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the complexity of the situation I'd created through my secrecy. Jessica's going to have a hard time with this, he said. Jessica's going to have to decide whether she wants to be part of a family or part of a financial arrangement, I replied, because those are two different things, and I'm too old to pretend they're the same. Through the community center's windows, I could see Jessica pacing in the parking lot, her phone pressed to her ear. Probably calling her father, probably trying to make sense of revelations that had turned her understanding of family dynamics upside down. Emma appeared at my side, tugging on my sleeve with chocolate cake frosting on her fingers. "Grandpa Harry, where did Mommy go? She's missing the best part of my party." I looked down at my granddaughter, her face bright with birthday joy, completely unaware that her mother was outside wrestling with shame and embarrassment that would reshape their family's future. "She'll be back, sweetheart," I said, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true. Sometimes adults need a few minutes to think about important things. "Is it about grown-up money stuff?" Emma asked with the perceptiveness that children often display about adult tensions. "Something like that." "Well, money stuff is boring," she declared with 9-year-old certainty. "Come see the present Uncle Robert gave me. It's a real jewelry box with a ballerina that spins when you open it, just like the one you gave me, but bigger." As she led me toward the gift table,
I reflected on the irony that my granddaughter had just summarized the entire afternoon more clearly than any of the adults involved. Money stuff was boring. What mattered was being present for the people you loved, celebrating their milestones, sharing their joy. The question now was whether the rest of my family could remember that simple truth, or whether Margaret Chen's revelations had permanently altered the foundation of our relationships in ways that couldn't be repaired. Jessica returned to the community center 20 minutes later, her face red from crying and her composure fragile but intact. She moved through the birthday party like someone walking through a minefield, carefully avoiding direct eye contact with me while maintaining the appearance of maternal involvement for Emma's sake. The party was winding down when she finally approached me near the cleanup area where I was helping stack folding chairs. Parents were collecting tired children, gathering leftover cake, and making the polite small talk that signals the end of successful social gatherings. "Harold, we need to talk," she said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual confidence. I nodded toward a quiet corner where we could speak without being overheard by the remaining guests. Jessica followed, her expensive heels clicking against the community center's polished floor with nervous energy. "I owe you more than an apology," she began, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I owe you an acknowledgement that I was completely wrong about everything." She paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to someone accustomed to being right about financial matters. "I spent weeks treating you like a charity case, lecturing you about financial planning, suggesting you couldn't manage your own affairs. I made assumptions about your worth based on appearances, and I was spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, betraying the depth of her embarrassment. "Jessica, you couldn't have known." "No," she interrupted firmly. "That's exactly the point. I couldn't have known because I never bothered to really know you. I saw your modest house, your careful spending, your simple lifestyle, and I made judgments without understanding the choices behind them."
Across the room, Emma was saying goodbye to her friends, distributing party favors with the generous spirit of someone who had received more gifts than she could have imagined. Her joy remained untainted by the adult complications swirling around her celebration. "I called my father after Margaret left," Jessica continued. "I needed to understand how someone could have that level of wealth and live the way you live. He reminded me of something I'd forgotten from my business school days, that the wealthiest people often live below their means, not above them." She looked directly at me for the first time since returning from the parking lot. But that wasn't really the lesson I needed to learn, was it? The lesson was about respect, about not measuring people's worth by their visible assets. I watched David helping Emma gather her birthday gifts, his movements careful and deliberate as he processed his own revelations about his father's financial circumstances. "What happens now?" Jessica asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," I replied. "The money doesn't change who I am or who you are. It just reveals what our priorities have been all along." Jessica's eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away. "I want to start over. I want to get to know Harold Whitman the person, not Harold Whitman the financial profile. I want Emma and Lucas to have a grandfather who's valued for his wisdom and love, not categorized by his bank balance. That's what I've always wanted too." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her careful makeup, but looking more genuine than I'd seen her since David first brought her home to meet Dorothy and me. "The education trusts you set up for the children. Margaret mentioned they'll cover undergraduate and graduate school at any institution." "That's correct." "That's an extraordinary gift. More than Robert has set aside for them. More than David and I could have provided even with years of planning." I thought about the patents that had generated those funds over decades,
the innovations in manufacturing processes that had improved efficiency for countless companies while providing me with steady royalty income that I'd invested carefully and quietly. Education was always Dorothy's priority, I said. She wanted to be a teacher before we got married, before life took her in different directions. This feels like honoring her dreams as well as securing the children's futures. Jessica nodded, understanding passing across her features. Will you consider staying in your house? I mean, if you want to, if you're happy there. I realize now that my concerns about your independence were really concerns about my own discomfort with your choices. I love my house, I admitted. It's where Dorothy and I built our life together, where we raised David, where I've maintained connections to a community that matters to me. I'd like to stay as long as I'm able. Then you should stay. And if you need help with maintenance, with anything, please know that we're here to support you as family, not as financial advisors. Emma appeared at our sides, tugging on Jessica's dress with hands still sticky from birthday cake. Mommy, Grandpa Harry helped me write thank you notes for everyone who came to my party. He has really good handwriting for a grandpa. Jessica looked at me with surprise. You helped her with thank you notes? When? While you were outside making your phone calls, Emma explained with 9-year-old directness. Grandpa Harry said it's important to tell people you appreciate them, especially when they take time to celebrate with you. The simple statement carried weight that none of us had expected. Emma had absorbed a lesson about gratitude and appreciation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with recognizing the value of human connections. That's exactly right, sweetheart, Jessica said, kneeling down to Emma's level. Grandpa Harry is very wise about those kinds of things. David joined our small group. Lucas balanced on his shoulders and several gift bags clutched in his free hand. Ready to head home?
He asked, though his expression suggested he was still processing the afternoon's revelations. Actually, Jessica said, surprising everyone, including herself, I was hoping Harold might join us for dinner tonight. If you don't have plans, that is. I'd like to cook for you, to start making up for some of the meals I should have invited you to share. The invitation was genuine, offered without the careful calculations that had characterized our previous interactions. I'd like that, I said, but only if you let me help in the kitchen. Dorothy taught me a few things about cooking over the years. I'd love the help, Jessica replied, and for the first time since I'd known her, her smile reached her eyes completely. As we prepared to leave the community center, I looked back at the empty hall where Emma's birthday party had transformed from a simple celebration into a moment of family reckoning. The decorations were being taken down, the bounce house deflated, the evidence of joy carefully packed away until the next celebration. But the changes that had occurred in our family dynamics would last far beyond the party cleanup. Margaret Chen's unexpected appearance had forced conversations we'd been avoiding, revelations that couldn't be taken back, and recognition that our relationships had been built on assumptions rather than understanding. Walking toward the parking lot with my son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because my financial situation had been revealed, but because the burden of pretense had been lifted from all of us. Emma skipped ahead, still wearing her paper crown, chattering about the friends who had celebrated with her and already planning next year's party. Her innocence remained intact, her joy undiminished by adult complications she was too young to fully grasp. Grandpa Harry, she called back to me, next week, can you help me plant flowers in your garden like Grandma Dorothy used to do? Of course, sweetheart, I replied, my heart full of gratitude for second chances and new beginnings. We'll plant whatever flowers you want." Behind me, the Riverside Community Center stood empty and quiet, ready for the next family celebration. The next moment when relationships would be tested and hopefully strengthened by honesty, understanding, and the simple recognition that love cannot be measured in dollars, but only in the time we choose to spend with each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.